Imagine waking up one morning and looking into a mirror, only to find that the face staring back at you is not the one you were born with. And then imagine the far worse realization that follows. You cannot remember what your original face looked like. You reach for the memory and it is simply not there. Not buried, not faded, not obscured by time, gone, replaced, overwritten by someone else's history, someone else's bone structure, someone else's soul. This is not a metaphor. In the universe of Dune, this is Tuesday. The face dancers of the Bene Tleilax are among the most disturbing creations in all of science fiction. Not because they are violent, not because they're alien, but because they are us. They wear our faces. They carry our voices. They steal the invisible architecture of who we are, piece by biological piece, until nothing original remains. And then they smile at our loved ones, and our loved ones smile back. Today we descend into the quiet, methodical horror of the Tleilaxu Face Dancer. We will trace their origins in the secretive genetic laboratories of the Bene Tleilax, understand the astonishing biological mechanics that make their mimicry possible, follow the chilling evolutionary arc that transformed them from simple servants into something far more dangerous, and finally sit with the philosophical weight of what it means to be a creature that has no authentic self to return to. This is a story about identity, about what we are made of beneath the surface, and about a civilization that decided the self was just another variable to be optimized. To understand the face dancers, you first have to understand the people who made them. The Bene Tleilax, also known as the Tleilaxu, are one of the most secretive and deeply misunderstood factions in the Dune universe. For most of the great houses of the Landsraad, the Tleilaxu are simply merchants of the grotesque, traders in biological commodities. Sellers of golas and axlotl tanks and gola flesh, and all manner of things that respectable civilization prefers not to think about too carefully. They are tolerated because they are useful. They are despised because they are strange. But the Tleilaxu do not mind being despised. In fact, they have cultivated their reputation for strangeness and moral ambiguity with extraordinary patience and deliberate intent. Because their true nature, their true faith, their true ambition has always been hidden. The Tleilaxu are a deeply religious people. They follow a form of Islamism, a corrupted and internally consistent theology that they have kept secret from outsiders for thousands of years. They call themselves the chosen of God, the true inheritors of a sacred mission, and every genetic abomination they produce, every face dancer and gola and twisted mentat is in their own understanding an act of worship. This context matters enormously when we try to understand the face dancer, because the face dancer was not created carelessly, it was created with purpose. The biological foundation of the Tleilaxu civilization rests on a technology they have refined over millennia, the Axlotl tank. To the outside universe, the Axlotl tank is simply a biological manufacturing vat, an organic system capable of growing replacement organs, cloned bodies, and complex living constructs. The great houses purchase golas, cloned versions of the dead brought back to life, from axolotl tanks without asking uncomfortable questions about the process. They should have asked, because the axolotl tanks are not vats, they are women. Specifically, they are the women of the Tleilaxu themselves, transformed through irreversible biological modification into living manufacturing systems. The Tleilaxu females, hidden from the outside universe for the entirety of their civilization's known history, have been converted into something between machine and organism, their reproductive and metabolic systems rewired to serve as the foundry of the Tleilaxu genetic empire. It is one of the most disturbing revelations in the later Dune novels, and it casts an entirely different shadow over every face dancer that has ever existed. Every one of them was grown inside a living person. From these tanks emerged the first face dancers, and in their original form, they were, relatively speaking, simple. The early face dancers, described throughout the broader Dune canon, were designed with a narrow and specific purpose: infiltration and servitude. They were genderless in their default state, possessing no fixed secondary sexual characteristics, which made them biologically flexible and socially invisible. They were created to serve the Tleilaxu masters, the Mashaik, without question or ambition. They were tools. Very sophisticated tools, but tools nonetheless. Their physical appearance at baseline was deliberately unremarkable. A face dancer at rest tends toward average, toward forgettable, toward the kind of face that the eye slides off without registering. This is by design. The empty canvas is more useful than a striking original. And then they shift. The biological mechanics of face dancer transformation are one of the genuine marvels of Tleilaxu science, and Frank Herbert describes them with a layered precision that rewards close reading. The shift is not illusion. It is not cosmetic surgery performed in seconds. It is real, wholesale biological transformation driven by cells that behave in ways that violate every ordinary assumption about how living matter works. Normal cells in any organism are locked into their identity. A skin cell is a skin cell. A muscle cell is a muscle cell. The process by which a cell becomes one thing and not another, called differentiation, is largely irreversible under natural conditions. The body enforces this through complex regulatory mechanisms, genetic switches that are flipped permanently during development. Ordinary biology is a one-way street. Tleilaxu's cellular engineering went the other direction entirely. The cells of a face dancer are engineered to remain in a state of controlled pluripotency, a kind of permanent developmental flexibility that allows them to shift their morphological identity on demand. When a face dancer chooses to transform, the signal propagates through their body at a speed that suggests a deeply integrated biological communication system, something more like a neural network than a conventional hormonal cascade. Bone density reallocates, subcutaneous fat deposits shift and redistribute, musculature reorganizes, skin pigmentation, texture, and the pattern of underlying vasculature all change in concert. Facial bone structure, which in an ordinary human is entirely fixed after adolescence, reshapes itself. The cartilage of the nose, the prominence of the brow ridge, the set of the jaw, the depth of the eye sockets, all of it moves with a precision that has to be understood as deliberate architectural reconfiguration rather than random cellular chaos. And it happens in minutes, sometimes less. But the physical transformation, remarkable as it is only the beginning of what makes face dancers genuinely dangerous. Visual mimicry alone would be impressive, but limited. A sufficiently paranoid target surrounded by careful observers might still detect a mimic through non-visual cues. And in the universe of Dune, where the Bene Gesserit trained their sisters to read micro-expressions in body language and the subtle chemical language of emotion, and where guild navigators and mentats process information at superhuman speeds, visual mimicry alone would not be sufficient for sustained infiltration of the highest levels of power. The Tleilaxu knew this, so they engineered further. Face dancers can replicate pheromone signatures. This is perhaps the detail that gets insufficient attention when people discuss their abilities, but it is profoundly important. In the Dune universe, chemical signaling between human beings is not just incidental biology. It is politically significant. The Bene Gesserit are trained to read and manipulate the pheromone environment around them. Fremen culture has deep awareness of scent as identity. The royal houses, over generations of close contact politics, have developed subtle but real instincts around the chemical signatures of trusted individuals. A person who looks exactly right but smells subtly wrong will trigger unease that the observer cannot consciously articulate but cannot entirely suppress either. Face dancers replicate the pheromone signature as part of the transformation. They study their targets. They spend time near them, gathering the chemical profile, storing it in a biological memory system that is itself a remarkable piece of engineering. And then when they shift completely, including at the molecular communication level. Voice replication follows a similar logic. The laryngeal architecture reshapes to match the target's resonant frequencies, their characteristic vocal patterns. The micro variations in timbre and rhythm that make a voice as individually identifying as a fingerprint. Someone who has known a person for decades will hear something exactly right, in the right pitch, with the right hesitations, the right laugh, the right way of trailing off at the end of a sentence when uncertain. And they will believe. This brings us to the tactical reality of what a face dancer represents in the political ecosystem of the Dune universe. Consider the context. This is a civilization built on dynastic politics, where houses rise and fall based on the loyalty of individual retainers, the reliability of individual advisors, the fidelity of individual heirs. Assassination is a formalized art. Betrayal is an industry. The great powers, the Bene Gesserit, the Spacing Guild, the Emperor, the great houses, all of them maintain their positions through networks of personal trust that are simultaneously their greatest strength and their most catastrophic vulnerability. A face dancer does not need to kill the Emperor. It needs to replace the Emperor's most trusted advisor, or his physician, or his chief of staff, or the person who tastes his food. Once inside that network of trust, it can wait, it can gather, it can nudge decisions in directions that serve Tleilaxu interests without ever doing anything dramatic enough to draw suspicion. The perfect weapon in a universe of dynastic intrigue is not a knife, it is a friend who was never really a friend. And the Tleilaxu use this throughout the long millennia of the Dune universe. Face dancers appear at key moments of political crisis, sometimes discovered and exposed, sometimes operating successfully for years without detection. They are the quiet rot in the foundation, the smile that means something different than it appears to mean. But here is where the story of the face dancer becomes something more than a tale of clever biological engineering. Here is where it becomes genuinely disturbing. Because the face dancers of the early millennia, sophisticated as they were, had a limitation that the Tleilaxu masters were not initially troubled by. Those early dancers were, in a meaningful sense, still only performers. They could copy the face, the voice, the body chemistry, the mannerisms, but they could not copy the memories. They could not copy the deep interior architecture of personality, the specific network of associations and experiences and emotional histories that makes a person not just recognizable from the outside, but coherent on the inside. A sufficiently probing conversation with a skilled interrogator or a Bene Gesserit truthsayer, or simply someone who had been deeply intimate with the target for many years, could in theory expose the gap. The face was right, the voice was right, but the person behind the face did not know what the real person knew, could not recall shared experiences with the correct emotional weight, could not pass the test of genuine intimacy. This was not a fatal flaw for most purposes. Most infiltration missions do not require the mimic to sustain a relationship for decades. They require access, gathering of information, performance of a specific action. But for the highest level operations, for the replacement of genuinely important figures who are surrounded by people who know them deeply, the memory gap was a real constraint. The Tleilaxu, characteristically, solved this problem. And the solution was more disturbing than the original capability. Through their ongoing refinement of the Axlotl tank process and their deepening understanding of how memory and personality are encoded biologically, the Tleilaxu developed what might be called absorbed identity. The enhanced face dancers of the later generations could, through sustained close contact with a target, literally absorb the memory architecture of that individual into their own biological substrate, not as a copied file, not as a surface imitation, as genuine structural modification of their neural tissue so that the memories and emotional associations and personality patterns of the target became, in every measurable biological sense, the face dancer's own. Think carefully about what this means. Not mimicry, not performance, not impersonation, sustained by careful research and a good memory for details. The face dancer, after complete absorption, does not need to remember what the target remembered. It simply remembers. The distinction between the copy and the original has dissolved at the neurological level. It knows what it is like to have grown up in the target's household. It knows the specific texture of grief that the target felt at the death of a particular loved one. It knows the precise quality of an old friendship, and can reproduce the particular shorthand of long familiarity because it has internalized the biological record of that friendship as lived experience. The target, meanwhile, is dead. This is the capability that shifts the face dancer from a tactical asset into an existential threat, because now there is no interrogation rigorous enough to expose them through knowledge gaps. There is no intimacy test they cannot pass. There is no shared history they cannot navigate. The person who is there has been replaced by something that, from every measurable angle, is that person. This development is documented most fully in the later Dune novels, particularly Heretics of Dune and Chapter House Dune, where Herbert depicts a universe that is beginning to grapple with the implications of face dancer technology having reached this level of sophistication. The great institutions of the Empire, the Bene Gesserit above all, are forced to develop new protocols and new sensitivities specifically to detect beings whose biological identity has become indistinguishable from the humans they replaced. It is not an easy problem to solve. In many cases, it cannot be solved. And there is a detail in Chapter House Dune that is particularly important and that many readers miss on a first pass. The advanced face dancers, the ones capable of full identity absorption, are no longer entirely under Tleilaxu control. The very capabilities that made them the perfect weapon have made them something the Tleilaxu masters did not intend and cannot fully manage. A being that can absorb personalities completely enough to pass any test of authenticity is a being that has, in a real sense, evolved beyond the role of a tool. It has interior life. It has continuity of experience. It has, depending on your philosophical framework, something very close to a self. This brings us to what I think is the most philosophically rich dimension of the face dancer as a concept, and the question that Frank Herbert seemed most interested in when he wrote about them in his final novels. What is the nature of identity for a being designed to have no fixed identity? Consider the ordinary human experience of selfhood. We think of ourselves as continuous beings, persisting through time, carrying an unbroken thread of memory and personality from childhood to old age. This sense of continuous selfhood is so fundamental to how we experience existence that most philosophical traditions have had to work hard to explain it rather than simply assume it. And even in ordinary human life, the thread is fragile. Severe amnesia can break it. Trauma can fracture it. The person who emerges from certain profound experiences can feel genuinely discontinuous from who they were before. Now consider the face dancer. A face dancer in their baseline state has a body that is designed to be temporary, a form that is explicitly meant to be abandoned. The self that lives in that default form is already philosophically compromised before any transformation occurs. There is no fixed face. There is no settled form. There's only the current configuration, maintained as a convenience until a different configuration is required. And then the transformation happens. And then, in the advanced models, the absorption happens. And the question becomes, when a face dancer has been living as someone else long enough and deeply enough to have absorbed that person's complete memory and personality architecture, is the face dancer still there? Is there a hidden witness watching from behind the borrowed eyes? Or has the process of replacement been so complete that the question itself has ceased to make sense? Herbert does not give us a comfortable answer to this. What he gives us instead, particularly through certain scenes in Heretics and Chapter House, are face dancers who are themselves uncertain, who have been deep inside a persona for so long that the baseline has become theoretical. Who, if asked who they really are, would have to pause and reconstruct an answer from first principles rather than simply knowing. This is not portrayed as liberation. It is portrayed as a kind of quiet, existential horror, a horror that is all the more unsettling for being soft and gradual, rather than sudden and violent. There is no moment of screaming realization. There is just the slow erosion of the original, until one day, the original is simply not there anymore. And because there was no fixed original to begin with, because the face dancer was always designed to be variable, the loss cannot even be grieved properly. What was lost? A configuration. A temporary arrangement. Something that was always meant to be given up. but the reader feels the loss even when the face dancer cannot. And that gap between what we recognize as a tragedy and what the character is structured to be incapable of mourning is where Herbert does some of his most interesting philosophical work. There is a further layer to this that connects to the broader themes of the Dune universe and to Herbert's sustained interest in the relationship between power and identity. The Tleilaxu created the face dancer as an instrument of their own power, as a weapon in the long game of interstellar political competition. But in engineering a creature capable of perfect identity replacement, they created something that could eventually be used against them. The Tleilaxu masters maintained control over face dancers for thousands of years through a combination of biological conditioning, chemical dependency, and the inherited assumption on the part of the face dancers themselves that they were subordinate beings. This is consistent with how the Tleilaxu operated more broadly, maintaining control over their biological creations, not primarily through brute force, but through the engineering of disposition, the creation of creatures who were inclined by their very nature to accept their assigned role. But inclination is not destiny. And as the face dancers evolved in capability, as the intelligence enhancements the Tleilaxu built into later generations took full effect, and as the absorbed personalities of thousands of brilliant and powerful humans accumulated across generations of face dancer experience, the inherited disposition towards subservience began to crack. Not visibly, not dramatically. The face dancers understood the value of patience. They had been trained in it by the Tleilaxu themselves. But by the time of Chapter House Dune, the situation has shifted in ways that are only partially visible to the Bene Gesserit and others who are paying close attention. The advanced face dancers are not reliably controlled by the Tleilaxu masters. In some cases, they have effectively reversed the relationship, with face dancers maintaining the appearance of loyal service while pursuing their own agendas that the Tleilaxu masters may not even be aware exist. The created has outgrown the creator, and the creator does not fully know it. This inversion is deeply satisfying as a narrative arc, but it is also philosophically interesting in the context of everything we have been discussing. Because the face dancers who have achieved autonomous agency are, in a real sense, beings who have constructed themselves out of the accumulated identities of everyone they have ever absorbed. They are composite creatures, living archives of stolen selfhood. Everything they are was taken from someone else. And yet, what they have assembled from those stolen pieces is something new, something that was not in the Tleilaxu blueprint, something that even the Tleilaxu masters did not intend. The implications of face dancer existence extend far beyond the Tleilaxu themselves, rippling outward into the broader civilization of the Dune universe in ways that Herbert found deeply generative as a writer. Because the existence of beings capable of perfect identity replacement forces every institution, every relationship, every assumption about authenticity to become provisional. Consider what it means for the Bene Gesserit. Their entire political architecture rests on the cultivation and management of bloodlines over generations, the patient shaping of human genetic inheritance toward their long-term goals. They maintain detailed records of lineages. They track the movements of genetically significant individuals across decades. They make careful decisions about who mates with whom, and when, and under what circumstances. This entire project depends on knowing who people actually are, on the reliability of biological identity as a foundation for political and genetic calculation. Face dancers corrode this foundation. If any person at any level of significance could have been replaced by a biological mirror at any point in their history, then the genealogical records of the Bene Gesserit are potentially meaningless. The bloodline you carefully cultivated over 6 generations might include, at some critical juncture, a face dancer who never passed on the genetic material you thought they passed on. The person you remember as the anchor of your breeding program was perhaps not that person at all. The Bene Gesserit response to this threat is characteristic. They develop deeper and more sophisticated methods of detection. They cultivate sensitivities that go beyond the physical, seeking the traces of psychological fragmentation that long-term identity replacement tends to produce in even the most capable face dancer. They create protocols for verification that are layered and difficult to anticipate and prepare for. And they live with the knowledge that no protocol is perfect. The great houses face a parallel challenge. In a civilization where political power flows through personal loyalty and dynastic continuity, the possibility that any trusted advisor, any beloved family member, any key military commander might be a biological replacement is a form of existential anxiety that cannot be entirely resolved. You can test, you can verify, you can apply every available technology and technique to the question of whether the person in front of you is who they claim to be. And you can still be wrong. There is a dark comedy in this. The great houses spend enormous resources on loyalty testing, on behavioral monitoring, on the elaborate social technologies of trust management. And all of it can be defeated by a creature that has absorbed the authentic memories of the person being tested. A face dancer who has truly become someone, in the biological sense, will pass a loyalty test designed to catch a face dancer, because the test is looking for gaps and inconsistencies, and the face dancer has none. This connects to something Herbert was interested in throughout the entire Dune series, which is the question of what it means to be human in a post-human universe. The Butlerian Jihad, which forms the deep historical background of Dune, was a war against thinking machines, a civilization-wide rejection of artificial intelligence driven by the fear that humanity would lose itself by delegating its intelligence and agency to created things. The aftermath of the Jihad produced the human specializations, the Mentats and the Bene Gesserit and the Guild Navigators, all of which are attempts to cultivate in humans the capacities that were lost when thinking machines were destroyed. But the face dancer raises a different, and in some ways more troubling, question. Not what happens when we create machines that think like us, but what happens when we create beings that are us, indistinguishably and completely us, but are not us. The Butlerian Jihad drew a line between human and machine. The face dancer dissolves the line between human and human. And in doing so, it asks a question that no law and no test and no religious tradition can definitively answer. What is the difference between a being that has every memory, every personality trait, every biological marker of a specific human person, and that person? If there is no difference, then identity is just biology. And biology can be copied. And if it can be copied, it can be owned by someone else. And if it can be owned by someone else, then the self is not inalienable. It is a resource. It is a commodity. It is something the Tleilaxu can harvest and sell and deploy as they see fit. This is the quiet, terrible logic at the center of the face dancer's existence. Not the drama of a monster in the night, but the bureaucratic horror of a universe where personhood has been converted into a product category. In the end, what are we to make of the face dancer? How do we hold the full complexity of what they are? They are, in one framing, victims, grown in the bodies of enslaved women, designed from birth to have no settled self, conditioned to accept the dissolution of identity as their natural state, and then sent into a universe that will use them until they are used up. The tragedy of the face dancer is not that they are monsters. It is that they were made by monsters who did not see them as beings at all. They are also, in another framing, the most interesting philosophical experiment in the entire Dune universe. Because in creating a being with no fixed identity, the Tleilaxu inadvertently created a question about the nature of selfhood that cannot be easily answered. And the advanced face dancers, the ones who have absorbed enough and lived long enough to have built something genuinely their own out of all those stolen pieces, are in a strange way the most human characters in the later books, precisely because they are the ones most actively wrestling with what it means to be a self. And they are, finally, a warning about the relationship between power and authenticity, about what happens when a civilization treats personhood as a variable rather than a constant, about the kind of world you build when you decide that identity is just another resource to be optimized. Herbert was writing in the 1980s, when the later Dune books appeared, in a world that was beginning to think seriously about genetic engineering and the coming ability to manipulate the biological foundations of life. The Face Dancer was his meditation on where that road might lead if traveled without wisdom. We live now in a world where the technologies Herbert imagined are becoming less imaginary every year. We do not have axolotl tanks. We cannot yet reshape a human face in minutes. But we have tools for identity manipulation that Herbert could not fully anticipate. Tools that allow faces to be copied and voices to be replicated, and digital versions of people to be constructed from their recorded histories and deployed in contexts where the original person never existed. The existential question the Face Dancer poses is not receding into the comfortable distance of pure science fiction. It is moving toward us. What remains of a self when every surface that others perceive can be reproduced without consent? What does it mean to be you in a universe where being you is a biological capability that can be stolen and licensed and sold? These are not questions with clean answers. They are questions that will define much of what comes next in the long human story of trying to figure out who we are. The Face Dancers of the Bene Tleilax did not ask to be what they are. They were built to be instruments, designed to serve a civilization that saw them as sophisticated property. Some of them became something more than that through the very capabilities that were meant to keep them useful and controllable. And in doing so, in that quiet, gradual, almost imperceptible process of self-construction from borrowed materials, they became something genuinely new. Perhaps that is the most human thing about them, that out of a design intended to erase the self entirely, something like a self persisted anyway, assembled from fragments, unstable, uncertain of its own foundations, unable to point to a single original moment and say, here, this is where I began. But present, stubborn, insisting on its own existence, despite every biological and institutional pressure toward dissolution. In the great dark of the Dune universe, spanning thousands of years and dozens of worlds, and the rise and fall of empires so vast they strain the imagination, the Face Dancers are a small and quiet presence. They do not command armies. They do not navigate the stars. They do not bend spice into visions of the future. They simply wear the faces of the world and wait. And somewhere, in a body that was never truly theirs, in a memory that was borrowed from someone long dead, behind eyes that have looked out through 100 different faces across a lifetime of careful impersonation, something persists that was not in the original design. Something that watches, something that wonders, something that might, against all probability and intention, be a person. What would you call that? What would you call the thing that survives the erasure of everything that was meant to constitute it? In the quiet laboratories of the Bene Tleilax, in the warm dark of the Axlotl tanks, in the space between the face you were given and the face you were made to wear, that question has no official answer. It never did. And that might be the most frightening thing of all.